to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and I am your host for this podcast. And I am delighted to welcome our guest today, Dr. Rachel E. Swallow, FSA. Known as the Queen of Lost Castles, Rachel is a castle and landscapes historian whose recent research reveals the lost stories of the legend, lady, and landscape of Edward I period castles in Wales. Founder of Swallowtail Archaeology, delivering expert research, writing, review, and public engagement in history, archaeology, heritage, and related fields, she offers fresh interpretations of historic sites and landscapes. With over 25 years of combined academic and commercial archaeology experience, Rachel specializes in reinterpreting forgotten earthwork and architectural remains within their wider historical and landscape contexts. A Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London, Honorary Fellow at the University of Liverpool, and Visiting Research Fellow at the University of Chester, she is widely published and recognized for making medieval Britain stories vivid, accessible, and engaging. So welcome, Rachel. I am delighted to welcome you to this podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Well, and I mean, one of the most intriguing aspects of your work is, of course, your interest in landscapes and castle archaeology. Can you go ahead and explain more broadly your areas of research and interest?
Well, as you introduced me as the Queen of Lost Castles, my areas are, unsurprisingly, castles, medieval castles. I know you had a podcast, didn't you, a couple of weeks ago, where you talked about what castles are. But my area of interest are castles, and actually lost castles in particular, before we get on to the Edwardian ones. And those castles can be lost because they're no longer in the landscape. We know about them because they're maybe marked up on a map or as a mound on a map, and we don't know whether it is a castle or not. So we look at context. So they can be completely lost. They can be mentioned in a documentary record, for instance, but we don't know where they are. They've been lost to time or lost to the environment or built over completely below evidence, archaeological evidence below buildings nowadays, for instance. So that's the one interpretation of lost. The other interpretation, which fits in with your theme, mischief and mayhem and misconceptions, and my interest is the fact that over time, there's so many layers of interpretation of what a castle is. We heard about that in a previous podcast. But also how they're interpreted and the values of time over time. So, for instance, I don't know, 19th century gender ideology and how that affects the interpretation of a castle, what it is. So when I think of a lost castle, I also think of something which is actually very visible, but actually could be lost in the meaning today of the original meaning, the original purpose. Can we get to that original meaning from today, going backwards? That's what I'm really interested in. It's trying to find original meaning, purpose. And to do that, my research method is to look at the context and to look at the context wider than I think most people have done before, and not excluding certain scholars, but certainly I am incredibly detailed in the way I look at the wider administrative area of a castle. I look at how a castle has informed the landscape, how it has actually developed the landscape, perhaps, or certainly altered the landscape, and how that landscape has also affected the castle, its form, its siting. So I look at that, both the physical side of it, so the geology, the geography. I look at the siting in terms of the purpose, whether it's elevated or not, whether it's near to river sources, to transport, to commerce. But I'll also look at the designed landscapes of the owners of the castle. They are, more often than not, which we're proving it, going further back to prove that castles were developed alongside a designed landscape which promoted the vision of the castle, but also provided a leisure aspect to a castle owner, castle builder, leisure, and also portrayal of symbolism in effect. So I look at my methodology, I look at my interests are castles and landscapes. I look and have looked at, for many, many years, I've looked at lost castles in terms of lumps and bumps in the ground. We
Yeah,
looked
the
at
lumps and bumps. Yeah, that was when we did the podcast with Dr. Vicky McAllister on castle archaeology and the landscaping. She mentioned the lumps and the bumps, but I think what's important, and I want to kind of, if you'll forgive the pun, dig deeper, is the aspect though of landscape, because a lot of people, when they think of castles, they really think of the structure and they think of their impression. And a quick shout out, I have just been asked by the Great Courses to lead a kind of adult study abroad in May to the castles of Germany. So I will be leading, if anyone's interested, you can check the Great Courses. I will be leading a tour to Germany in May for the medieval castles of Germany. But of course, we're starting with Neuschwanstein. And of course, that's not medieval at all. But everybody knows Neuschwanstein because that's the Disney castle. Shout out to Disney. But also, people have that image in their head. That's the image they've got. They've got the turrets, they've got the emplacements, the parapets, they've got the curtain walls. And that is, of course, a reality. But if you're dealing with lost castles, you don't have that. You've got to find where there might have been a castle and then how the landscape, of course, shapes that discovery. Can you explain a bit more about how you find those lost castles in order to find the context? Because you got to know they're there somehow. Does that make sense?
It certainly makes sense. It is. Or where do you start? Well, first of all, how do you know there was a lost castle there? So that's the first piece. So as I mentioned earlier, it could be you've got cartographic evidence on a map, for instance, that could point to a previous castle, or a field name, for instance, or we know from documentary sources that there was a castle in place X, for instance, and where was it? So we could start off with a sort of nugget of information like that and then expand it. So we got 2 or 3 pieces of the jigsaw, and to gather the rest, I look at documentary sources. I scour where gathering information where perhaps people might have stopped, or I re-look at documents and go back to the original language, which you also talked about in your first episode, is looking at the original language and trying to take my interpretation away and look at perhaps what was actually meant, who was writing the document, who was it being written for. I'll also look at things like legend and literature and as well, to see about arguably the contemporary view by the poet or the writer of a particular site as well. But more readily, I'll look at certainly the documents, the maps. I'll look at map progression and I'll take that back. I'll try and get hold of the estate maps. I'll map roads I knew were in existence at the time. So I'll use something called GIS mapping, geographical information systems mapping, so a bit of tech, to map onto, to start creating layers of what was the wider landscape in terms of access to a site, by looking at the position of roads, rivers, the sea. In fact, we mustn't forget to look beyond access to the sea as well. We can perhaps try and get a picture of where a castle site might well have stood. So that's the more practical, commercial looking at the castle, where it might have been. But I'll also look at things like aerial photographs and also LiDAR, light detecting radar, which is also taking images of the ground, stripping the trees and current buildings back to see if we've got any evidence of some earthworks. Looking at field systems, we can have place names and field names that we can date to a certain extent where the derivation of the place names come from, what period. We can get an idea of when the landscape was created by looking at those. We can't definite, but they can give an indication. Field names, as I mentioned earlier, might mention a castle, might mention a mill, it might mention something that indicates that there's a power structure and a landscape surrounding that power structure.
So when you see like road names that might be Millstone Road, or even a local pub that might have a kind of a heritage name to it, that might be the Mill and Splendor or something, something like that. And you're like, okay, there must be a story behind it. And then when you look for the stories behind it, then you take that story and you go backwards to see where you can find those threads. So your approach is very much an interdisciplinary approach.
Yes,
which
it
is one of those things. I mean, a lot of castle archaeologists are castle archaeologists and historians, and a lot of historians do look at literary texts. But in some cases, it's like, well, it's literature, it's fiction. I mean, I'm a literary historian. I'm well aware that when people are like, but is this real? Okay, it's fiction. Let's be honest. But we can actually extract factual information from literary texts where perhaps the poets were encoding in their own literary landscapes real things and real markers that they would see every day. I remember years ago, I heard a student give a paper questioning the design of the chapels in the Book of Kells in the Illuminations. And this student was positing, oh, well, perhaps it's a reference to the Church of Jerusalem. Well, yeah, but also if you're an Irish monk or an Irish illuminator, all you have to do is look out your window, because the Irish temples, the small early Christian churches that are temple in Irish, they look exactly like the ones in the Book of Kells. So it's entirely likely that they looked at their own landscape in order to draw or talk about things in their texts and manuscripts. Do you find that literary texts give that possible insight into lost castles because it may not just be fiction?
Yes, most definitely. We do have to be careful. As you rightly said, we do have to be careful and marry that up with other evidence, because we all like a good story, can always, we can tell a story to a child now, we can embellish that story and we can add to it and so on. Yes, we do have to be careful. But for instance, the story that I've looked at the most in terms of, it's not a lost castle, it's a very significant castle. It's a Carnarvon castle in Gwynedd, and it's Edward I's castle of, it started building it in 1283, so it's definitely medieval and it's on Welsh territory. And so that's the story there, is that it was Welsh territory, and there's a story from the Mabinogion, the 13th century tales, which could actually be older. They could have been written down at a later date, but we know they were written down in the medieval period. And that story that I particularly looked at is a story called, in English, The Dream of Maxen Fledig.
You can give the Welsh as well.
I can try to.
You can.
You can correct me. So it's right, now I've got to try and get my pronunciation right, but it's the Broider Maxen Fledig.
The Brothers Matter Flagrant, yeah. I mean, the thing about Welsh, and it's been a long time since I've studied it, and the pronunciation, it's like you have the Mabinogion, like Pwyll Pendeich Dyfed, which is the story of, it's Pwyll, Prince of Dyfed. That's part of the Mabinogion as well. The Mabinogion is a fascinating text because the 4 branches of the Mabinogion detail different lines of the legendary history of Welsh princes, but they intersect, like Branwen daughter of Llŷr, with Ireland, and you see that kind of cross contact. It's also Culhwch and Olwen is one of the earliest Arthurian stories that has King Arthur as the background, and Ysbaddaden, the giant. And if my Welsh friends are like, that's not how it's pronounced, I'm sorry. I'm out of practice with my Welsh. Please, please, please feel free, anyone, to correct me. But it's interesting because Carnarvon is a huge castle. I mean, it is, and Carnarvon, correct me if I'm wrong, or please feel free to explain, it is still the castle of the Prince of Wales, is it not? That is part of the investiture of the current British royal family. So Carnarvon has that unbelievable continuous history even to this day. How does
Mhm.
that affect the way that you see the landscape of a castle like Carnarvon?
Well, that's the thing. It's continuity of significance, and significance can change depending. It's subjective, isn't it? But it can change over time. But certainly, in I think it was I think yes, it was 1986 that it became a World Heritage Site alongside Conwy, Beaumaris, and also Harlech castles. Harlech, my favourite, I have to say.
My friend Wendy Turner said Harlech is one of her favorites, and I will say that I was very very fortunate after the International Medieval Congress at Leeds to attend the castle tours with Kelly de Vries and Robert Wisdom Savage, formerly of the
Yes.
Royal Armories, and we did the castles of the Welsh Marches. We also did the Edward I castles of North Wales. That's when we did Harlech, we did Conwy, we did Beaumaris, we did Carnarvon. So I have seen all of these castles you're talking about. And if you ever have a chance to go to Wales, North Wales, South Wales, I toured South Wales with a friend of mine who lived there in Llanachli. Go. The Welsh castles are amazing. But all of those amazing castles, of course, were built as part of Edward I's attempts to subdue Wales under English rule. Now, there are Welsh castles that were built in response as kind of a massive big fuck you to Edward I, which is fine because Edward, not a nice guy on multiple levels. But those castles are still part of that exchange of Welsh and English identity, are they not, to some extent?
To some extent, yes. I mean, as you rightly said in a previous podcast, it gets political. It
Always.
gets political, of course it does. And I've really tried with my research to bring out the Welsh story. So I look at it as English imposition with Castilian because Edward's wife is from Spain. So we've got an international blend of input onto a Welsh landscape. But I look at the Welsh landscape as continuity. There's continuity there because my theory is, and I've published this, is that the Edward and Eleanor, his wife, Queen Consort Eleanor de Castile, deliberately incorporated the Welsh landscape and the Arthurian legend, which brings me back to that question you asked me about the
Yes, absolutely.
legend
Please.
of I'm going to say it again, but the dream of Max and Ledig. I won't say it
Yeah,
in Welsh. I'll leave
that's fine.
that to you. So the dream, and I believe they deliberately incorporated that. And how I came to that conclusion was by piecing the jigsaw together and realizing that the castle, very, very obvious, it's not a lost castle. Yes, we've lost a lot of it, but it's very much there. But how there's an awful lot of layers of interpretation over the time, particularly in the 19th century when it was reconstructed, conserved, preserved, however you might describe it. There's a lot changed in the castle then. As it was made more stable, more accessible. Following on from the 19th century, we got an awful lot of reinterpretation of what each of the towers meant and so on. But the studies up to I came along and predominantly concentrated on the castle and the walls themselves, which are extremely important. As we mentioned, they're part of the UNESCO site, the significance, they're the best examples in Europe, which is why they've got that status. But nothing really was looked at beyond the castle walls. And by considering this dream of Maxen Fladu, I'll call it the dream, we look at it's based on a real emperor, Magnus Maximus, who was made an emperor in Britain of about AD 383, and who held the Roman fort in Carnarvon, which is about a kilometre to the east of the castle. So I'm thinking already we're looking at something else very important, different period, outside of the castle walls. So should we take that into interpretation when we're looking at this lost story of Carnarvon Castle, which I argue is lost, the Welsh side, the Welsh input? because this castle was imposed on a Welsh landscape where we know there was a llys or palace of the Welsh princes. So we know that this is really important site. So we've got a fort, and that fort is called Sagontium. And when we look back at the dream is very explicit and very descriptive of a landscape. And that landscape describes Ynys Môn, which is Anglesey, which is the island to the south of Gwynedd. It's in Gwynedd, but it's to south of the castle of Carnarvon and across the Menai Straits. So big, broad tract of water, effectively, that wraps around the castle to a certain extent, certainly to the south.
Yeah, because it is on the water. I mean, that's one of the main features of Carnarvon is it is on the water, and it is a castle that you can see from the shore, I mean, all these different angles. And one of the extraordinary things about Carnarvon, especially because of its size, and it is massive, is it reminds me of the scene in that horrible film First Night with Sean Connery as King Arthur, Julia Ormond as Guinevere, and Richard Gere, Y-O-Y, as Lancelot. I mean, that movie is so bad on so many levels. But there's this amazing scene where he shows her Camelot from a distance on the hill, and it's her first glimpse of Camelot. And they base the image from the film on the Très Riche de Duc de Berry. So the 15th century Duc de Berry, it's got all the blue roofs and the turrets, and everybody, you can tell who the good guys are in Camelot because they all wear blue. In this movie, everybody's color coded. It's bizarre. But it reminds me of Carnarvon because we could see Carnarvon from a distance, and you can see this. It is a medieval castle. It's what you think of. It's almost Disney-like in what you think of this castle. So the situation next to a Roman fort is important because, of course, a lot of people forget or don't even know that there's that Roman history first, and where the Roman forts are established made very good places for castles.
Absolutely.
So is that part of that landscape that you talk about?
It is. So I look at that landscape in two ways. If we continue, you mentioned medievalisms there, but if you look at the first of all, the keeping to the King Arthur bit of that. At one point, the castle was completely, or what was there before, was completely surrounded by water. It's almost like an Avalon, really.
Oh wow! Okay.
So we've got the Menai Straits to the south, and around the castle to the east is the River Cadnant, and to the River Sayont, beg your pardon, and the River Cadnant to the north, which no longer exists. It's built over now, but you can just about make out in the landscape, the townscape, where it would have run. So those river systems would have almost completely surrounded the castle. We've got archaeological evidence. So moving on from that, that's quite Arthurian in terms of its placing in a landscape. So it's quite, as you say, Disneyland almost. We've got references to in the death of the King of Arthur, La Mort le Roi
Arthur. Yeah. There's a whole variety of them. Mallory, of course, Mort Arthur. The French is Le Mort Roi Arthur. Then you've got, of course, the Middle English versions. Yes, and they all describe, of course, the Rex Futurus, Rex Quondam et Rex Futurus, which is the once and future king. He's taken off to Avalon, which is an island. Yes. I mean, the Mort Arthur in all of its iterations often plays into these modern medievalisms, but also the interpretation of castles. And they would have at the time as well, would they not? To an extent?
I absolutely believe that because of what we know about Edward and Eleanor. So we do know that approaches to castles, so in that particular story, the castle of Dularoz-Gard, that's an approach by water. So this imagery is created in the Dream of Maxon as well. This approach by water, by ship, and accessing the castle in the dream, where he meets Ellen, who is sitting in the castle. whatever castle was then, because it was written prior to Carnarvon being built by Edward. So was that the Roman fort of Saguntium, or was it something that was actually on the same site of the castle now?
Right.
Recent archaeology actually suggests that and it certainly makes sense to me, that there would have been some sort of fort guarding that port, or some sort of building, Roman building, beneath Carnarvon Castle is today, and archaeology supports that. There's some sort of archaeology there. So Dunstable Castle, also in the northeast of England, also there's a suggestion that it's an Arthurian landscape surrounded by water, meant to be approached by water. So we've got that aspect, and so that's something I've been looking at. But looking at the dream of Maxen, who was really Magnus Maximus in real life. He was a real emperor who had Saguntium Fort down the road to the east of the castle. The description is so clear. We've got what was called Snowdonia, the mountain range, which is now Eryri, which can also mean Eagle Mountain. But we got that in visible, or indivisible from the castle as it is today. But the only bit of land that's not enclosed by water leads out towards the fort. So we've got a linking.
So it almost connects them. Right. It's like a connection almost, like a causeway almost.
And we know there was a Roman road there. We know from the research I've done that Roman road was reused in the medieval period. And at the time, we've got the documents at the time of Edward I that confirms that road between the castle that he was building with Eleanor, I argue, was also connected to Saguntium and the neighbouring church of St. Peblig by a road called the King's Way. So, which more or less follows that Roman road out to. So we got a connection between the past, a physical connection between the past. Along that route would have been visible, archaeology supports this, as well as travel writer texts of the 16th century. Those are another source that I would use. What would have been visible to Edward and Eleanor when they were building that castle, or had castle built for them, would have been a number of artifacts, really, monuments in the landscape. We would see them today, but Roman remains in the landscape that would have lined that route, including burial grounds and various other storage features and bridges and so on, all Roman, that would have been still in the landscape for them to see along what I call a processional route between the castle and the church of the wider administrative area.
Yeah, I mean, so this implies, of course, that what Eleanor and Edward were tapping into is the place itself and its own history, and they were drawing on that heritage of the Roman emplacement and kind of saying, yes, but we're claiming it. This is our political space, and because it's in Gwynedd, I mean, this is part of the subduing the Welsh princes to English rule. And is it not Edward I who first establishes his son and heir as the Prince of Wales? I believe that it is Edward I who first comes up with that designation for his son Edward, who will become Edward II.
Mm-hmm. Yes, apart from the Welsh princes of Wales, of course.
Obviously, yes. The Prince of Wales as the heir to the English throne, as opposed to the pre-existing independent princes of Wales that Edward essentially conquered and subdued, and essentially built those castles as ours. So Edward is stamping English identity on the Welsh marches, but also within Wales, in order to claim that Welsh space for England. And that's part of why he uses Prince of Wales as a designator for his own heir.
Yes. And it's legitimacy through continuity, isn't it? So it's using effectively the Welsh tales effectively Arthurian tales. We've got a lot of Arthurian influences in the landscape. We mentions nearby. We know that there was a round table at Nevin, which is just down the road. We know that Arthur's crown was received from the Welsh.
There are round
And
tables
yeah,
everywhere. Just ask
everywhere.
Winchester.
But yeah, we're dripping with them. But
Yeah, right. But
so
that's an
yeah,
important thing because King Arthur, especially in the 12th century and leading through the 13th century, because Edward is at the end of the 13th century. And of course, for those of you who've seen Braveheart, I mean, that movie sucks on multiple levels, but that is the Edward the First we're talking about. There's a lot wrong with that movie. There's a lot, but Edward, that's him. And that idea of tying the current English monarchy in the Middle Ages to Arthur was necessary because, of course, it is that political campaign of Henry II who says, we got a problem. There's this text by Geoffrey of Monmouth that says that there is this once and future king who's going to come back and drive out invaders from England. That's us. We're the invaders. So we need to find a body. And it was his campaign with the monks at Glastonbury to encourage them to find the grave of Arthur. And it's actually in 1191 when Richard I is king, the 5 minutes he was in England, king for 10 years, in England for a grand total of 6 months. But it is under his reign that they find a grave. And of course, the grave is very conveniently labeled because it's a body of a man and a woman with a nice lead cross that says in Latin, of course, not at all. But here's the grave of Arthur and his Queen Guinevere. Convenient. And then they dig them up and they put them in a glorious tomb and everybody comes to the pilgrimage at Glastonbury. That's at the end of the 12th century. But that legend and the need for that continuity, because those legends of Arthur's persisted in the Welsh tradition. And the idea of Arthur as kind of this grounding, heroic figure in opposition to English rule continued. So do you see Edward kind of appropriating that and saying, no, it's us. It's us.
Yeah, we've got an awful lot of evidence for us to know that Edward and Eleanor were both into Arthurian tales, Welsh tales, mythology, perhaps some fact. Her brother, Eleanor's brother, wrote Arthurian tales. I think that I called the article that I wrote about this Living the Dream, because I do believe that they assumed this power of this mythology to continue the legitimacy through continuity of the Welsh and Roman landscape, this imperial landscape. We know that through the rebuilding of or the building of the castle itself, which is very Roman in its character, and that's another story. But do they? Yes, I do, because Glastonbury is what I was thinking about. We got Arthur and Guinevere. They're almost taking on the personas of these two. But at Carnarvon, we also know Maxim. By the way, this dream that he met Ellen. Ellen was in this dream, and he actually lived it out. He sent his soldiers ahead to confirm that yes, this was real, and then he went himself and he approached Carnarvon, the castle by the river, saw the mountains and so on. And then he came across this beautiful maiden sitting in a rose gold chair, so a Welsh gold chair.
As you do.
As you do. There's a lot more detail than that, but you can imagine the end of the story. So they got married, but Ellen, depending who's writing about Ellen, there's an awful lot of mythology there. And this relates to what you're saying about it's Eleanor's namesake. I don't think that's quite a strong pull for her, I'm sure, when she's looking at that landscape and trying to make that landscape hers. And Ellen was the daughter of a Romano-British leader, we believe, called Olaf Hen. But she's often conflated with Helen of the Ways. who created the road system, the Roman road system in Wales. Again, how much of that's myth? But certainly, you mentioned Geoffrey of Monmouth earlier. He describes Helen as Saint Helena, who was
Mother of, say, of Constantine, and the mother of
that's right.
Constantine, who was responsible for finding the true cross, which, of course, because Constantine in 314, before he fights a battle, he sees a vision, and it's an image of the cross in the sky, and it says, with this symbol you will conquer. And so he adopts Christianity supposedly on the spot, and then conveniently his mum goes and finds the true cross. Yes, it's a very popular story. And of course, there's loads of true crosses as well. And if we put all of the pieces together, we'd have the Ark. But the story was believable on multiple levels. And so you do have Helena, Elaine, Eleanor, and you do kind of have that continuity. And even Eleanor of Aquitaine, to a certain extent, kind of creates a connection with, because she went on Second Crusade with her husband Louis, the first husband, disaster. But she was an extraordinary woman too. And you do often see these ties of women named Eleanor back to these historical personages.
That theme of piety, isn't it, as well? Yeah. But part of the true cross is supposed to have been delivered to Carnarvon in Edward's time as well. So we've got that connection. But according to Nennius, a Welsh medieval writer, he says that that Constantine the Great's son was buried at the church at Carnarvon. So I mentioned the church St. Peblix, which was adjacent to the Segontium. It's a later, obviously, built because it's early medieval, and the Roman fort is obviously Roman. But there was supposed to have been a Roman Mithraeum at the site of St. Peblix. And it's at that site that Nennius says that Constantine the Great's son, Constantine as well, was dug up there. So we got that. But not only that, Constantine the Great was supposedly Arthur's grandfather, according to some sources. So we keep getting this.
Yeah, and you do get that in Geoffrey of Monmouth, especially. In the Vita Merlini too. This connection back to Marcus Aurelius, but also to the whole Roman line. And I'm not saying Arthur is Roman, because that's nonsense. That's a 2004 movie and also nonsense. But but it's important for this tie, because these medieval authors, are working with a landscape people recognize. They know that this is Roman. It's not like people go, there's a pile of stones over there, I wonder what that was. They know. They are aware that this is Roman history. They are aware of the remains because there's so many of them. So it's not like it's a mystery to them. They just incorporate it and develop their own legendary histories. Yeah.
And according to some chroniclers, Magnus Maximus was also discovered by Edward and, we assume Eleanor, but Edward certainly was discovered in the area of St. Peblix Church and reburied. So we've got almost like a mirror activity, really, of reburial and assuming the persona, perhaps, and the landscape and his territory of Magnus Maximus, the Roman emperor. So, yes, I do think there's an element of taking on this, I'm the emperor now, I've got new lands, this is my land, and I'll take on the Welsh stories because it supports my claim.
Right. And it also then ties him to that Welsh history I would say with a varying degree of success. To basically say, but no, look, I'm part of your national narrative. Seriously, you should totally accept me as your king. Really? Whatever. I did want to just one thing you mentioned, the Mytharium. Is that one of the temples to Mithras? Is that the?
Yes. Sorry. Yes.
So explain.
Well, I mean, it's a temple of prayer, isn't it? It's a temple. Yes. Yeah.
Because Mithras was a Roman. The cult of Mithras, or the religion of Mithraism celebrates Mithras, who is in some ways very parallel to the Christian narrative, but was very popular among Roman soldiers. And so the Mithrarium is essentially a temple for the worship of Mithras, which again ties into some of those pre-Christian religious iconographies and ideas that survive. And then some of those traditions make their way into medieval Christianity. So.
That's right, and it's that the Christian undertones, isn't it? So it's
Yeah.
early Christianity, it's the birth of Christianity, it's the birth of the identity of Maximus for Edward and Eleanor, in effect, Ellen as well, Helena, um, and it's that. Well, in that case, then why have we got this King's Road connecting the two? Previously a Roman road. So they're assuming all the communications as well. So this journey that they're going through. And we've got Christianity, we've got piety, we've got legitimacy, we've got native tales. It's almost like, we'll assume the tales so that it gives us more integration or more acceptance, perhaps. But when I looked at what it's connected to, what's going on, it's connected. Yes, this Kingsway just stops short of the castle itself. If we go take it right up to this Gontian fort, there still remains today. St. Pebbley's Church, we've got 14th century elements of it, but believed to be on the site of a Roman temple, as we've mentioned, of 4th century. So we've got very Roman area with new builds in the medieval period on that area. The road connecting the Kingsway connects to the castle to the east and just falls short of it. So I thought, well, why? What's going on? But what it does see, if you're walking or on horseback in those days, with all your elite friends and so on, because this is very much private land. It wasn't within. There would have been nothing there really, apart from these monuments, Roman monuments and so on in the landscape. We could see hills, we could see Eryri, Snowdonia, as it was called. We've got the landscape features as we can describe very clearly in the dream, but it's not enclosed as far as we know. It's not an enclosed area. It's quite, but it's protected. It's his elite, and it's accessible by the River Seant. So that would have been heavily defended. But what we see as we've got a back to St. Pebbling's, a back to Sigontium as we're approaching the castle from the east towards the castle itself, is the Queen's Gate. And that fascinated me. That as far as I was concerned, that's what was lost about that castle, is that nobody really looked at why that, I think, is very grand castle gate, what it actually was built for. It's described as being less attractive, less aesthetically pleasing, maybe less functional than the King's Gate, which is to the north of the castle build, which faces the town. So that is protected by the town walls, very grid-like structure of the town.
But if you're coming from the Roman part, what you come to is the Queen's Gate.
Comes to the Queen's Gate, which is overlooking that King's Way.
Yeah.
And it's would have overlooked, had there not been modern houses put there in the 19th, 20th century, it would have overlooked Sigontium Fort and the remains of Sigontium Fort and St. Peblig. So this I see as very much a route of between Christianity, secular power, royal power, elite power. And then when I looked at the evidence, we've got evidence of, I could talk about this for hours, so I'll condense it into, we got evidence of a garden. We've got evidence of a garden that might well have been constructed after Eleanor had died in 1290. So the castle started in 1283 to be built then. She died in 1290. A lot of the castle was built after her death, but the plans would have been in place. And she was known for her gardens. She was known for the Islamic influence, the fountains she created, the unusual birds, and very exotic fruits, trees, and animals and so on in her gardens and parks. So we've got evidence that below the Queen's Gate would have been a garden that was created. In fact, we know from documentary sources that it was a garden area. It was called the Garden of the Princes. So I believe from my research that it belonged to the Welsh princes prior to Eleanor. So again,
She
taking on a
appropriates
continuity
it.
land. Yes, it's
Yes.
cultural appropriation, perhaps we call it today. I
Yeah,
don't
absolutely. Because if it's well, and I mean, you mentioned the Islamic influence, and I think it's important to point out because this is actually a book project and a new research project that I've been starting, and now I'm actually really working on. Is about that religious syncretism, is about
Mm,
that syncretistic tradition where different religious ideas and iconography and imagery combine together into something unique and different. And a
yeah,
lot of people assume that medieval Christianity was this one whole homogenous orthodoxy, and it's not. And people traveled, and people brought in artisans from North Africa, from the Iberian Peninsula. So there is a lot of Islamic
yeah,
influence, especially in decorative gardens, but without any kind of censure, without any kind of sense of God, don't use that because that's from Islam. And
yeah,
people, kind of modern people, assume that these things would have been absolutely opposed to one another, but they're not. So Eleanor, of course, of Castile is Castile, Spain. And at
yes,
this time, the Iberian Peninsula, you have the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, but the majority of the Iberian Peninsula is in fact under Muslim control. So
yeah.
it would make sense that she would incorporate and adapt this into her own landscape.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there are hints that she was criticized for extravagance, but hey, there's
But extravagance is not quite the same thing as, oh my gosh, you use something is, Muslim. That's not the problem. It's the extravagance and how much it might have costs more than
yes.
anything. So,
Yeah, and we've got evidence of documentary evidence of gardens being created at Edward's so-called Edward's castles. I believe that it's her home as well, and so
yeah, and that's
and
that's
that's
an important point that that we'll get to, because I want to hear about you've mentioned repeatedly the idea of Edward building but also Eleanor building, and that was something that when Vicky and I were talking the podcast, she mentions the Irish female castle lords.
yeah,
And I gather from your research that, of course, most people assume castle building is a masculine domain, that this was
yes,
exclusively, I mean, yeah, women lived there, but men did the building and men did the architecture, the design for defense. Yes, they had to live there. So, can you talk about Eleanor's place and perhaps the place of women in the process of castle building?
yes. But I think documents tend to talk about the men. They talk about the kings more often than not. So we can only assume that because women did, the queen consorts did have the power, and I like to think they're quite feisty actually. It's particularly Eleanor. The more I read about her, the more I learn about her. Yeah, feisty,
She
independent.
Yeah, I was going to say, she joins the long list of, oh no, wait, these are not exceptions. Eleanor of Aquitaine is not an exception. You have
Exactly.
Adela of Blois. You have Empress Matilda. You even have Stephen's wife, Matilda. You
Yeah,
have all of these women who, in some cases, have to take up arms when their husbands are dumb shits and get themselves captured. Stephen, his Matilda kicked ass. Even William the Conqueror, his wife Matilda. I mean, these women are not placeholders. They're not simply just consorts. They're active. There's a
no.
reason that the most powerful piece on a chessboard is the queen.
Well, yes, and yes, precisely. And actually, Eleanor was really into her chess, and I think most queens were, but Eleanor, we know about that. And she was into her hunting. She did what we might think in modern day society as being traditionally male in the medieval period. This misconception. I mean, let's keep with Eleanor for a minute. For instance, the Queen's Gate was only called the Queen's Gate in the 19th century. It wasn't called that before. It was the gate overlooking the garden. And
Okay.
it's placed very high overlooking garden, another subject for another day. But queens were very much involved in the construction, building, design of gardens, and Eleanor we know was. We've got several examples of that. But actually, the power as well. I mentioned her quite a few times because we know that she's got gardens elsewhere, but we also know that she was very acquisitive in her own right. She gathered up her own manors and lands, and actually, I she certainly built or rebuilt castles on the Welsh Marches, which is something that I'm looking at the moment, looking at that research there, where predominantly we know that mostly widows and heiresses of a lesser breed, if I dare say that, so not queens, but certainly ladies.
Aristocracy, yes, the gender.
Yes,
Yes,
thank you.
yes.
And yes, that sounds very judgmental of me, wasn't it? But yes, certainly of our own kind.
If you're not royal, you're nothing. You're nothing. No, I mean, but this is a very important point, because the question is who writes the documents. And, honestly, if the kings are signing the checks, as it were, if the kings are issuing the orders, then those are the names that are recorded, but that does not exclude anybody else from the process. And as you say, this was going to be her home. And as a king might move around from castle to castle for royal processions, for basic, reminder to the Welsh people, fuck you, we've got this. But the kings would also go off on campaigns. He was busy, creating all kinds of havoc for Scotland and being a jerk up there. So I'm not a fan of Edward I for that. He did a lot of very important laws for England. He was a good king for England. He was lousy for the Welsh and lousy for the Scots. Let's just be clear about that. And the Irish. Everybody was bad for the Irish up to that point. But while he's away and while he's on these campaigns, Eleanor's in charge. I mean, Eleanor, his wife, his consort, the women are the ones who are in the castles all the time, when the men may not be.
Eleanor probably isn't the best example for that. We do know that she stuck with him. She left her children behind being looked after, and she stuck with Edward. She went with him everywhere.
That's an important point too. Then. Yeah, because I did not know that. Yeah,
including on Crusade, she went with him. So that's 2 years out of her life in supporting her husband on Crusade. So maybe she's not the best example of that, but the fact that they were together constantly, I think they did things together.
I mean, he is not he's not popular in Scotland. He's not popular in Wales and in Ireland. But also, of course, 1290 is when Edward ejects the Jewish population from England. And of course, because Eleanor is from Castile in Spain, I mean, the Iberian Peninsula had several communities of both Jewish people and Muslim people and Christians who lived kind of side by side. And so she, of course, becomes bound up in Edward's anti-Judaism and his anti-Semitism. Can you talk about at least the need to acknowledge that part of her history?
I think it's important to acknowledge it because current, present day and recent scholarship has condemned her involvement in that. I mentioned earlier about acquisitive. She was very acquisitive of lands. Certainly in the lands that I've looked at, that it's not the case, but she is. There is evidence that she took on lands that previously belonged to the Jews, who perhaps couldn't pay back their debts because of this situation, and she absorbed those lands and took them on for her own. And there's a lot of criticism for that looking back. At the time, how acceptable was that was going on? That wasn't just Eleanor, it wasn't just Edward, it was happening in their forebears. That was happening. Of course, it reached a climax with the 1290 edict of expulsion.
Yeah.
But Eleanor died in that year. So it's argued that perhaps she wasn't involved in that. But she would have been, as I said before, they were partners in crime or otherwise.
Right.
They know they were partners. So she would have been aware of that. She did take advantage of that from records that we know about. And that, of course, is not acceptable today. How acceptable or what at the time, we can only speculate, but certainly I imagine it certainly wasn't, particularly with the Jews, but with the society as a whole, how acceptable that was that at the time.
Well, and that's part of the
Yeah,
question we get with certain literary texts. I mean,
yeah,
Chaucer's Prioress's Tale and how much it engages with the massacre of the Jews in that text and that context. Chaucer, of course, is criticized for both being anti-Semitic or anti-Judaic, specifically against Judaism, but also at times critical of it. I mean, I have written about Chaucer's Prioress's Tale, and I argue that the way that the prioress tells the tale, Chaucer's making fun of her for being anti-Semitic. But
yes.
there is this tendency, we want to say, well, she was amazing. Eleanor of Castile did these great things. So, well, we can't just gloss over the
No,
possibility that she was involved in that anti-Semitic expulsion or the process of appropriating the lands of Jewish people herself.
exactly. We've all got a dark and light side, and we cannot just capitalize on our stories by just looking at the good points. She was known to be acquisitive in her own right, and we need to look at that. And I do know at least one scholar is looking at that quite closely, and I welcome that. I think it's really, as I said earlier, looking at context. We need to get to know the characters best as we can. We also need to be aware that we're putting our own modern day spin on it, which doesn't mean that it's right. It doesn't make it right that we've got, what she did or supposedly did or Edward did, and how we interpret it. But we need to be as honest as possible and have that big picture of who that person was. She created beautiful gardens, but she also acquired land, perhaps not very legitimately or very politically correct.
Yeah.
Uh,
Or even, and I think this is an important point when we talk about misinterpretations of the Middle Ages. As much as we can say that things were, that things in the Middle Ages were not the way that modern society likes to portray them. There were, I've said this in the first podcast as well, they're not, people were not necessarily as bigoted, as horrible, as, single-mindedly Christian as modern audiences think. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. There certainly is a persecution thread against Jewish communities throughout the Middle Ages, starting in the 12th century with, the massacres, the pogroms that happened with the whole stories of the Jewish kids being murdered, and blood libel. And blood libel is a very real medieval atrocity enacted against Jewish communities and Jewish people. And so it's important to say, while there was, in some respects, a lot more tolerance than we think there were certainly also awful aspects
Absolutely.
of that anti-Semitic violence and anti-Islamic violence in the Middle Ages. And you can't get around it when it's Edward I expelling the Jews from England in 1290. So if she is his partner, she has to in some way have been involved in that.
Exactly. I mean, it was 1275, wasn't it, that Edward issued the Statute of Jewry, where he forbade the Jews to lend money with interest. So there's history. There's history there within history.
And whether it's a specific anti-Judaic tendency because he had a problem with their religious beliefs, or whether it is financial, and that interest, that question of loaning money at interest. Well, what king doesn't need money from somebody? The Jewish population had the dispensation to lend money at interest because for Christians it was usury. For Christians it was a sin. They couldn't do it. The Knights Templar have that dispensation that they're allowed to lend money at interest. Well, that's why, that's why the King of France has them rounded up and tortured and accused of a whole bunch of nonsense, because he doesn't want to pay back a debt. So the persecution of the Jewish communities and taking their land may have been because they were Jewish, may have been because it was financial, maybe it was political. It could have also been all of those things.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of what you do in Swallowtail Archaeology, it's important to look at the whole picture.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can't gloss over the less desirable bits of history. We can't do that. We have to take the whole picture as far as we can, find the whole picture first, and then interpret.
Brilliant. Yeah.
She had all the trappings of queenship that she had at Carnarvon, and she held it herself. Edward went with her. We have charters signed by him at Overton. They seemed to stay there every year for 3 or 4 years for 2 weeks at a time. Was this leisure? Was it about hunting and so on before they went over to Carnarvon to build the castle? It's just before they laid the first stone at Carnarvon, they stayed at Overton. These things are lost because perhaps she's a woman. It's not important because it doesn't exist anymore. So significance can be lost through time because things are lost or rewritten or overwritten or not written at all.
Which is actually, swallowtail archaeology is very important for understanding that historical interpretations have to be fluid to an extent because we are always learning new things. Yes. And we're always discovering new things and finding that sometimes older interpretations were too informed by the moment in which those interpretations were created and less on the actual historical moment when the event happened. So when you talk about public outreach and talking to groups, why is that so significant, particularly now?
Well, to go back to what you're saying about the a number of the guidebooks, the original HMSIO guidebooks, His Majesty Service Office guidebooks, the blue guides, as we often call them, for castles, were written in the 1960s through to the 70s and sometimes even the 80s. And they were reprinted with few amendments, maybe.
I have some of those, yeah.
They're fabulous. They're highly informative. The thing about them is they're almost set in stone in themselves, but we have to remember that they're post-war and they're written in quite often military deterministic sort of approach. So we have to remember that might be partly why women tend to be sidelined as well during that period. This is all about these are war machines. These are for purely
it's for defensive war purposes, and it's focused on less on the castle as a structure where people lived as an actual home, instead focusing on the military defensive purposes. And I mean that's been really in the last 30 years kind of an aim of a lot of castle historians and archaeologists, is saying no, these were not just for defense and or to withstand a siege. People lived there. This was, they lived there. They had to want to live there, and that's part of it as well.
And even that takes you onto your second part of the question about the community outreach, the public engagement. I think it's so important to talk about what I found to the communities who own that heritage, who feel that they own it, it's part of them. And it's important because they know it better than me in a different way. And they know about stories and they know about what that field was called beforehand and what that might indicate. Or somebody found this in their back garden and that might indicate. And people need to feel part of their own history. One of the scariest times that I've ever had of giving a talk was to Carnarvon itself. I'm clearly not Welsh. I have Welsh ancestry, but I don't sound in any way Welsh whatsoever. So I was quite nervous. But by bringing out the Welsh story and asking them to add to it, we got a two-way conversation, and it was so useful. But I believe that what I find out shouldn't be put on a dusty shelf. It should be picked over. It should be discussed. It should be interrogated. It should be assimilated, maybe. But it's not mine to hold. And I think it's really important to have that two-way engagement and to talk about what heritage means to people.
And what today really is, and what is really heritage? Because, I mean, particularly in the US, heritage is often weaponized to a certain extent in order to encode a certain sense of privilege or even white supremacy and racism. In this country, heritage in some ways has become kind of a dirty word because of how it's been used here. But of course, English heritage, I mean, there are those elements in England that would embrace it the same way, but not entirely. And I mean, there are so many ways in which local people really do try to revive and live their own history And so it's important that they know what that actually is. But you can't just go in there and go, no, that's wrong. You guys are doing it wrong. You're totally misinterpreting it. Do you find that they're very receptive when you open those dialogues?
Absolutely, I do, but it's because I present the evidence without saying, and the summary is, and this is right. This is how I interpret from the evidence I've gathered. Can you add anything to it? Is there anything you would take away and why? And I think when I'm looking at the context of a place, I'm looking at present day society as well, whatever that means, whether that is anti Carnarvon Castle, for argument's sake, or pro it, or no thoughts whatsoever. Everybody's got a thought. And the other thing I'd like to emphasize as well is the number of people who think that because they're not a doctor or haven't got a degree or haven't in history or archaeology or both, whatever, that they haven't got a say. And I think we're talking about lived experiences. No, perhaps not the queens and kings, but those castles would have affected everyday lives in some way or another. And they are lived experiences and they're part of our background. We can learn from these ourselves, perhaps by examining the architecture, the archaeology, by understanding perhaps what that bump over there what actually meant, and it was actually quite significant once, but it just gets in the way of the plough now, sort of thing. But it's like learning these things about our past we don't need to be a doctor or a professor to be able to do that. We've all got a say in our history, in the
Well,
way we look at it.
well, and that was kind of how I was going to sort of wrap up the discussion to an extent, in terms of what can we learn from this historical approach. I mean, how can modern society learn from medieval society, especially if we approach it in that interdisciplinary way and in that conversational way, and engaging not just with artifact and medieval literary text, but with modern lived experience? What can modern society learn about the Middle Ages and about themselves from that approach?
Well, about themselves, perhaps that by looking at context, by gathering the pieces of evidence, there is perhaps a different picture. By putting things, perhaps there's a different way of looking at things. Why did people put boundaries where they did? Why did they elevate castles and churches to be looked up at? Why was there indivisibility between the secular and the religious? Why? It's about being able to ask questions and to get that thought process, and perhaps we can then turn that on to ourselves. Perhaps that sounds very deep, doesn't it? But it's just this idea of gathering evidence and having a different way of looking at things. It can also, I think, my own story is that Eleanor, in effect, studying her journey also helped me in mine. I had a very difficult period of my life. Who doesn't? But mine was particularly difficult when I was studying that. And I just feel that having a focus on somebody else's life and putting yourself in their shoes, so almost, and I probably was hyper focused, but on studying her, but it can take you out of yourself and actually have a perspective on somebody who could, her life maybe could perhaps teach us something, or something about medieval life as well as our own. In particular, I'd say with Eleanor, is resilience, strength, the multidisciplinary effect in herself, really. The fact that she gathered sources from multiple places, countries, and so on, and her influences were multicultural. And I think that we can learn from that. But what we can actually learn from medieval castles and their landscapes, I think, is obviously highly subjective. But I think it's understanding space and place. I've mentioned the fact that I've referred loosely to the fact that well-being, we can be in a place of studying or looking at history and archaeology where it can take us out of ourselves. A lot of these sites can be in the middle of nowhere, but it's great for getting out and about, but actually learning about understanding why those lumps and bumps might have been there, and the fact that these structures, castles, might not necessarily just been about fighting war. They would be about also rearing children, animals I should say, and then bringing up children, and also, you know, having a family life, and also leisure. And the fact, yes, that's a very elite leisure, surrounded by parks, landscapes that are very
Cultivated and
restricted
cultivated,
access to that. But all the same, they are about living as well. The way different people live or lived is a very important way of looking at it, I think, in my opinion.
Well, and I want to just say that this has been an extraordinary conversation. And thank you so much, Rachel, for joining me. And I am Dr. Larissa Tracy, and thank you for joining us for this episode of Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.
Thank you.